It began in the kind of room where every sound carried, where the tension was so thick you could feel it pressing against your chest. The crowd murmured, restless, waiting for the next exchange. Then came the moment. Sharp, venomous, unforgettable. The antagonist leaned forward, lips curled in a smirk, and spat words designed not just to wound but to humiliate. It wasn't an argument anymore. It was a performance of arrogance, a public attempt to strip dignity from someone who had earned every ounce of it. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others exchanged looks of outrage as though silently asking, did they really just say that? The air turned electric, charged with the audacity of the insult. It wasn't just a jab at one person. It felt like a slap in the face to everyone who had ever worked hard, sacrificed, or dreamed of belonging. And yet the so-called villain didn't stop there. They leaned back with the smug confidence of someone convinced the crowd would cheer their cruelty. But the silence that followed was heavier than any applause. The stage was set, the insult delivered, the trap seemingly sprung. But no one expected what happened next. The insult might have hung in the air like smoke, but the damage it carried was far deeper. This wasn't just one person mocking another. It was the kind of attack that rippled outward, tapping into old wounds, into centuries of being told you don't belong here. For many in that room, and for countless others who would later watch the clip, it felt like a line had been crossed, a public declaration that dignity itself could be trampled for sport. The villain, emboldened by their own bravado, didn't retreat. They doubled down. With every word, they painted themselves as the gatekeeper of legitimacy, as though their voice alone could decide who was American enough, worthy enough, human enough to stand on that stage. Their gestures grew sharper, their tone dripping with the kind of arrogance that thrives only when unchecked. To them, this was a spectacle. To everyone else, it was a test of values. Because this moment wasn't about politics in the narrow sense, it was about identity, belonging, and the story a nation tells about itself. When one figure sought to belittle, to erase, the question became clear. Would silence let that narrative stand, or would dignity push back? Cameras captured every flicker of expression, every murmur of disbelief from the audience. And beyond those walls, millions were watching. Phones lit up, recordings went live, hashtags began forming in real time. But the true unraveling, the breathtaking reversal that would leave even the most jaded viewers stunned, had not yet begun. Viewers across America had no idea how quickly this would unravel. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to know who the antagonist truly is. Their story was never one of quiet service or sacrifice. It was built on spectacle, on a brand of arrogance polished into an image. For years they had perfected the art of bending rules without ever breaking them outright, skating just close enough to the edge to taste scandal while somehow dodging accountability. To their supporters, this swagger looked like strength. To those who paid attention, it was a mask hiding rot. Whispers of corruption followed them everywhere. Backroom deals, contracts that always seemed to land in the hands of their closest allies, promises made with a smile and broken in silence. Each controversy seemed to vanish in a storm of bluster, as though sheer arrogance could erase the paper trail. Hypocrisy became second nature, preaching discipline while indulging in excess, demanding loyalty while betraying anyone who got in their way. And yet, despite it all, they kept climbing higher. They learned to wield power like a weapon, silencing critics with intimidation and rewarding sycophants with scraps of influence. Their empire wasn't one of respect, it was one of fear, of people calculating it was safer to nod along than to speak out. But dramatic irony has its own cruel rhythm. The very arrogance that fueled their rise was now about to expose their fragility. That smirk, that overconfidence, the sense that they were untouchable. It was the same script they had run for decades, yet this time the stage was bigger, the cameras brighter, and the audience far less forgiving. For years they had convinced themselves that dominance was the same as legitimacy, that humiliation was the same as victory. They believed their empire was built on stone when in reality it was only sand, kept standing by fear, by silence, by the absence of someone strong enough to challenge them head on. That challenge had finally arrived, and as the room sat frozen, waiting for the next words, no one realized they were watching the slow collapse of a dynasty built on arrogance. Long before the spotlight ever found them, the protagonist's story was written in quiet perseverance. They were the child who arrived with little more than a suitcase and a dream stitched together by their parents' sacrifices. The new land was not always welcoming. The accent drew stares, the name was often mispronounced, and the barriers seemed endless. But through every closed door, they learned resilience, not as an abstract virtue, but as survival. They carried groceries for neighbors, studied under flickering lamps, and watched their parents toil without complaint. Service wasn't a slogan in their household, it was a necessity. When others looked for shortcuts, they learned patience. When others sneered at their difference, they found strength in it. Every step forward was earned, every accomplishment a testament to dignity carved out of adversity. As they grew, their empathy became impossible to ignore. They were the person who listened when others dismissed, who offered help when others turned away. Their rise was never fueled by arrogance or privilege. It was a grassroots climb, one conversation, one hand extended, one small victory at a time. People underestimated them precisely because they refused to shout, yet in that quiet they built trust. Their service took many forms: volunteering in communities others ignored, speaking for those who were overlooked, standing firm when silence would have been easier. They weren't flashy, they weren't groomed by wealthy patrons or political machines, and their foundation was dignity, their armor forged in the lived reality of hardship. And still they were often underestimated. Critics mistook humility for weakness, empathy for naivety. They believed someone so soft-spoken could never stand against the sharp edges of arrogance and cruelty. But the people who knew their journey saw something different, an unshakable core, a resilience that had been tested too many times to break now. In a world where power is often confused with volume, they embodied a quieter truth that real strength is the ability to endure, to rise, and to carry others with you. And as the stage lights blazed and the insults flew, the years of struggle, sacrifice, and silent victories converged into a single moment. The hero who had once been overlooked was about to be seen clearly, by allies, by enemies, by an entire nation, and that resilience would soon be tested in front of millions. The air grew heavier with each exchange, like a storm gathering force. The villain, already intoxicated by the sound of their own voice, pushed harder. What began as a sharp insult turned into a barrage, each line more venomous than the last, their words cut with cruelty, laced with a mocking confidence that dared anyone to challenge them. Gasps punctuated the air as the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some covered their mouths in disbelief, others shook their heads, murmuring to neighbors. Every insult landed not as a clever point, but as a naked attempt to bully, to dominate through sheer volume. The villain's voice grew louder, their gestures wilder, as if raising their tone could mask the hollowness of their arguments. And yet, the hero did not flinch. They stood with an almost unsettling composure, their face calm, eyes steady. While the villain's words ricocheted around the room, the hero allowed silence to become their ally. Each pause, each measured breath reminded the audience of the stark contrast before them, arrogance on one side, dignity on the other. The villain mistook this calm for weakness. They pressed on, voice cracking under its own fury, sweat beading on their forehead. But with every insult, their mask slipped further. What was meant to humiliate only exposed their desperation, their need to be feared, their fear of being irrelevant. The audience could sense it. Whispers grew louder. Phones recorded every second. The spectacle was no longer about what the villain said. It was about how small they looked next to someone who refused to be rattled. And as the tension reached its breaking point, the villain leaned in for what they thought would be the final blow. But the silence that followed was not weakness, it was the drumbeat before an earthquake. The hero was about to speak. When the hero finally raised their hand, the room fell still. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, just a quiet signal that they were ready to speak. The villain smirked, leaning back with arms crossed, convinced nothing could pierce the armor of arrogance they had been building all night. But that confidence was about to shatter. The first words came softly, almost like a whisper, and the silence that followed made them thunder. The hero didn't match insult with insult. Instead, they began with truth, measured, deliberate, undeniable. They spoke of sacrifice, of families who worked tirelessly, of neighbors who came together not because they were told to, but because dignity demanded it. Each sentence landed with precision, not as a weapon, but as a mirror, reflecting the villain's cruelty back at them. The audience leaned forward, hanging on every pause. Gasps echoed when the hero revealed contradictions in the villain's record, hypocrisies hidden in plain sight. A silence settled as the villain's smirk faltered, their eyes darting nervously, hands fidgeting with the notes they no longer trusted. Then came the turn, the moment that transformed the room. The hero shifted from defense to offense, recounting not their own hardships, but the countless stories of people who had endured worse and still stood tall. It wasn't just about one insult anymore. It was about every immigrant told they didn't belong, every worker dismissed as replaceable, every voice silenced by arrogance. The hero carried them all into that room. And then, pause. A silence so profound it felt like the world itself had stopped to listen. When the hero delivered the closing line, it was less a retort than a revelation, a simple truth that stripped the villain bare. The crowd erupted, applause crashed like thunder, people rose to their feet and the cameras caught every stunned expression. The villain tried to recover, opening the mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Their facade cracked, sweat visible, confidence gone, the swagger evaporated under the weight of a single moment of dignity. It wasn't a debate anymore, it was a reckoning, and everyone watching knew exactly who had won. But the real shock came after the cameras stopped rolling. The clip didn't just end in that debate hall. Within minutes, it was everywhere. Phones lit up across the country, the hero's words replayed again and again, echoing in living rooms, cafes, college dorms, and late-night shifts. On Twitter, hashtags exploded to the top of the charts. #truth wins, #dignity over hate, #mic drop moment. Memes spread like wildfire. The villain frozen mid-smirk side by side with the hero's calm, piercing gaze. TikTok stitched the moment with music, edits, and reactions of people literally jumping off their couches in celebration. News anchors scrambled to keep up with the tidal wave. Some described it as the debate moment of the decade. Others said it was a turning point in the national conversation about identity, belonging, and leadership. Influencers who rarely touched politics shared the clip with captions like, "This is why representation matters." Late-night hosts couldn't resist replaying the takedown, their audiences roaring with laughter at the villain's collapse. But the most powerful reactions weren't from celebrities or pundits, they were from ordinary Americans. A nurse tweeted that she watched the clip between shifts and cried because it felt like someone finally spoke for her. A teacher posted that her students were buzzing about it, saying they'd never seen dignity win so clearly over arrogance. Immigrant families wrote about watching together, parents telling children, "See, that's why we never give up." The ripple effect was unstoppable. What began as a single exchange in one room became a national reckoning, a viral affirmation that arrogance could be challenged and beaten. People who had felt invisible suddenly saw themselves reflected in a hero who didn't need to shout to be heard. It wasn't just about politics anymore, it was about pride, resilience, and collective empowerment. The villain had aimed to humiliate, but instead they sparked a movement of solidarity. And as the momentum built, a larger question emerged. If one moment could shake the narrative so powerfully, what could happen next? When the storm of reactions finally began to settle, the hero stepped forward once more. Not to gloat, not to revel in victory, but to reframe the moment into something greater. They reminded the audience that debates come and go, elections rise and fall, but values endure. What happened in that hall wasn't about scoring points, it was about proving in real time that dignity will always outweigh hate, that truth cannot be drowned out by lies no matter how loud they are shouted. The hero spoke not as a politician, but as a neighbor, a parent, a fellow American. They pointed to the countless faces who had reached out in the aftermath, immigrants who had built lives from scratch, workers who kept communities running through hardship, young people searching for a reason to believe in the future. Each of them, the hero said, carried a piece of this victory because the moment belonged to all who had ever refused to bow to arrogance. It was an emotional reflection not about who won or lost, but about what kind of country we choose to be. Do we measure strength by cruelty or by compassion? Do we celebrate power built on intimidation or resilience built on service? The answer, the hero declared, was written in the applause, in the hashtags, in the voices of millions who stood a little taller after watching the exchange. The hero did not claim perfection, nor did they pretend the journey was over. Instead, they framed the clash as a reminder that America's greatest strength has always come from those who endure, who rise, and who insist on being seen. And in that framing, the hero became more than a debater. They became a symbol of resilience, of belonging, of hope. Because in the end, the lesson was clear. Dignity is not just a shield against hate, it is the force that transforms struggle into strength, silence into voice, and conflict into unity. What began as a simple debate had become so much more, a defining moment where arrogance tried to dominate and dignity refused to bow. The title of this story, once just words on a screen, now carried the weight of a nation's heartbeat. It reminded us all that when hate steps into the spotlight, truth has the power to outshine it. But this isn't just a story to watch, it's a story to carry forward. Every share, every conversation, every moment of standing tall in your own community adds to the ripple that began here. If this moment inspired you, don't let it end when the video closes. Subscribe, stay connected, and become part of the movement that insists on compassion over cruelty, service over self-interest, and resilience over arrogance. Because the real victory doesn't belong to one person on a stage. It belongs to everyone who refuses to be silenced. It belongs to you. So share this with someone who needs the reminder. Add your voice to the millions who believe that dignity is stronger than hate. And remember, the fight for truth is never over, because in the end, truth always wins.